By 7:30 a.m., the army led by General Oberg of Hanover had reached the elevated areas of Lutterberg. At that time, the luminous flashes from the French artillery in Landwehrhagen, where Broglie had temporarily halted to await the arrival of Soubise's main forces, became visible. Now, Oberg faced a crucial decision, whether to continue his retreat with Soubise's army in pursuit or engage in battle. Following a brief council of war, the participants argued that it would be perilous to proceed with the retreat towards Munde, considering the challenging terrain and the proximity of the French forces. Taking these factors into account, Oberg chose to take a defensive stance. He hoped that the forested and rugged terrain southeast of Lutterberg would significantly impede or even halt any sizable enemy detachment attempting to flank his positions. In June 1757, amidst a period of turmoil characterized by conflicting public opinion and King George's differing vision for the government's war strategy, an administration was formed against the king's objections. Consequently, on the 29th of June, the Pitt-Newcastle administration assumed power. While eventually hailed as one of the most successful in British history, the initial indications were far from promising. Just before taking office, the newly appointed ministers received distressing news of Frederick's devastating defeat at Kolin. The new administration received urgent pleas from King Frederick requesting decisive support. To Frederick's pleasant surprise, Pitt displayed a remarkable level of sympathy towards this idea. Pitt orchestrated a simulated invasion of France at Rochefort. Unfortunately, due to various delays, the invasion proved unsuccessful and incurred a cost of £1 million, resulting in nothing but humiliation. Following the equally disastrous Battle of Hastenbeck, negotiations were initiated on the 3rd of September with Danish mediation, but without consulting Frederick. Surprisingly, an agreement was reached within 5 days. Under the terms of the Convention of Klosterzeven, the French were permitted to maintain their occupation of the majority of the territories they controlled. This agreement effectively neutralized the Hanoverian front, prompting Richelieu to redirect his forces southward toward Halberstadt, commanding an army of 40,000 men. The Allies faced a series of unfavorable developments. In August, a Russian force emerged victorious over the Prussians at Gross-Jägersdorf. It was not only the Russians, French, and Austrians that posed a threat to the Allies. The Holy Roman Empire also rallied against Prussia, recruiting an imperial army of over 30,000 soldiers led by the Duke of Saxe-Hildburghausen, which began its northward movement from Fürth in August to unite with the French auxiliary army under Soubise, but a turning point was on the horizon. The Prussian fortunes began to shift in the east. Shortly after the Battle of Gross-Jägersdorf, Russian General Apraksin ordered a retreat to Tilsit. Furthermore, on November 5th, following weeks of strategic maneuvering, the Prussian army engaged in a battle with a force twice its size commanded by Soubise and Hildburghausen. This encounter resulted in the epic Battle of Rossbach, considered one of Frederick the Great's strategic masterpieces. The Battle of Rossbach marked a significant turning point in the 7 Years' War, as the Prussian triumph caused a tremendous sensation. Above all, the psychological impact of this victory was overwhelming. The victory at Rossbach significantly accelerated the momentum of Anglo-Prussian cooperation. The magnitude of this triumph compelled King George to re-evaluate the peace treaty he had signed with the French. As the winter progressed, Prussia experienced a resurgence. While they suffered a setback at the Battle of Breslau, they quickly rebounded 2 weeks later at the legendary Battle of Leuthen, securing another remarkable victory against the Austrians. After the disgraceful events involving Cumberland at Hastenbeck, leading to his dismissal, and the decision not to honor the Convention of Klosterzeven, the search for a suitable commander for the Army of Observation commenced. On November 9th and 10, King George proposed Ferdinand of Brunswick for the position. The cabinet joyfully accepted the suggestion, and Ferdinand himself emphasized his reluctance to be restrained by Hanoverian hesitations. As a condition of accepting the command, he demanded direct access to George and complete freedom in conducting operations. Ferdinand assumed his command on November 23rd, and the former Army of Observation, technically the Army of the Elector of Hanover, was now referred to as His Britannic Majesty's Army, highlighting the British strategic interest it aimed to serve rather than Hanoverian concerns. During November and December, Ferdinand focused on training the army and boosting its morale. Meanwhile, a French army corps led by Duc de Richelieu moved against the newly formed Allied army. However, Ferdinand took the initiative and struck first. Exploiting the advantage, he repelled the French garrisons that were in winter quarters, suffering from limited supplies and reinforcements. On February 18th, 1758, he successfully recaptured the town of Hanover, and by the end of March, the electorate was cleared of French troops. The cost to the French was significant, as their morale suffered greatly, while the Allied army regained its confidence. On June 23rd, the Hanoverians achieved victory over the French army at the Battle of Crefeld. The French sought to encircle Ferdinand's army, destroy it, and occupy Hanover. In September 1758, during the French offensive in Hesse, Prince de Soubise advanced on Einbeck, defended only by a small force under Prince Isenburg. Ferdinand of Brunswick detached General Oberg with 14,000 men to support Isenburg. Soubise retreated first to Göttingen and then to Cassel. The Allies pursued closely, and soon both armies were positioned near Cassel, facing each other. As de Soubise retreated, he received reinforcements under Constandes, bolstering his forces to a total of 78 battalions and 68 squadrons, amounting to 42,000 men. Crossing the Fulda near Kassel, de Soubise established his camp to the south and southeast of Bettenhausen, strategically positioned behind the Losser stream. On the same day, General Oberg positioned his troops on the heights near Sandershausen. He also dispatched his supply train to Munden. Oberg commanded 17 battalions, 20 squadrons, and the Hanoverian Jagers, with an approximate total of 14,000 men. Despite being outnumbered by de Soubise's army, Oberg contemplated accepting battle due to the advantageous defensive terrain. Duke de Broglie devised a plan to encircle the Allies' left wing and sever their retreat, assigning Chevert to execute the maneuver. Additional artillery and a detachment led by Marquis de Castries were positioned to threaten the Allies' line of retreat. However, upon learning that his positions had been flanked and concerned about the security of his communication lines, Oberg opted to retreat, leaving a detachment behind. Chevert and Comte de Lussas maneuvered around the Allied flank, while Fitzjames positioned himself to the right of de Soubise's corps. Eventually, Broglie discovered the complete retreat of the Allies and initiated a pursuit. After 3 hours, Broglie conducted a reconnaissance of the enemy position and launched cannon fire to impede their deployment. At Landwehrhagen, Broglie learned that Chevert was now approximately 3 kilometers to his right. Fitzjames, meanwhile, positioned himself to the left of Chevert's corps. By 7:30 a.m., Oberg's army had reached the heights of Lutterberg. Oberg faced the decision of either resuming the retreat and being pursued by Soubise's army, or opting to engage in battle. Following a brief council of war, it was argued that continuing the retreat toward Munden through challenging terrain with the French closely behind would be perilous. Consequently, Oberg chose to make a stand and deploy his army. The right wing of Oberg's army was secured by the wooded heights between Spiele and Lutterberg. The left wing extended up to the Kleine Stauffenberg, where Oberg positioned his artillery. The Hanoverian Jagers were positioned near the Fulda to protect the Allies' right flank. Major General von Zastra was tasked with covering the left flank, aided by the Kanitz infantry, Prince Isenburg infantry, and 2 squadrons of Bock dragoons stationed in the forest south of the Gross Stauffenberg. They were joined by most of the Hanoverian Jägers. The front of Oberg's position was safeguarded by a deep ravine with marshes at its bottom. The village of Lutterberg lay behind the Allied lines. Upon realizing that the French were attempting to flank his position, Oberg made the decision to extend his left wing, compromising the strength of his centre by redeploying his entire second line to the left. Around 11 a.m., Major General von Post led the advance with the Post Infantry, Oberg Infantry, and 2 squadrons of Prince Friedrich Dragoons, taking their positions on the western slope of the Gross Stauffenberg and positioning themselves north of the Strauch Heath. Simultaneously, Major General von Bock maneuvered towards the Gross Stauffenberg to provide support to Zastro's detachment. Additionally, 5 6-pounders were positioned there. By 1 p.m., Soubise had completed the deployment of his main force. His left wing consisted of 8 battalions, 16 squadrons, and 1 artillery brigade, positioned in the forest to the northwest of Landwehrhagen along the Fulda Scarps. Another 39 battalions were deployed in 2 lines on the heights directly east of Landwehrhagen. Fitzjames commanded 10 battalions, the cavalry was placed in the 3rd line of the centre, and 20 squadrons were positioned to the west of Landwehrhagen, behind the centre. During early noon, Soubise ordered Chevert to resume his march towards the Allies' left wing. The French artillery, positioned along the entire line, began firing. Chevert conducted a flanking march through the forest to the northeast of Sichelnstein. Zastro, realizing the threat, was compelled to shift his troops to the left of the Gross Stauffenberg. The French guns unleashed a vigorous cannonade against the Allied positions. Zastro, who had not completed his maneuver to change fronts, found himself faced with the head of Chevert's columns emerging from the woods. Recognizing that he did not have enough time to finish his deployment, Zastro decided to march towards the enemy with the Karnitz infantry and Prince Isenberg infantry, successfully driving back the French grenadiers. As the French grenadiers were pushed back, 18 squadrons charged through their own retreating grenadiers and struck the disordered Hessian battalions from the front and flank. Unable to withstand the impact, the Hessian battalions broke and fled from the battlefield. During the clash, the outnumbered Allied squadrons of Zastro's detachment were unable to halt the charge of the French cavalry. Outflanked and overwhelmed, they were forced to retreat, with Zastro himself being wounded in the combat. They joined the other Allied battalions rushing to their support as Chevert launched an infantry attack. Hearing the gunfire, Soubise ordered his main force near Landwehrhagen to initiate an attack. However, the left-wing cavalry faced delays due to the marshy meadows. Simultaneously, 12 Saxon battalions on the left advanced against Post infantry and Oberg infantry, positioned to the right of Zastro's troops. The Allied guns immediately opened fire on the Saxon column as it emerged from the forest. Despite the barrage, the Saxons stormed the Gross Stauffenberg. Prince Xavier led a frontal assault while another part of the column executed a flanking maneuver. They drove back 2 Hessian battalions and captured 6 guns at bayonet point. Post infantry and Oberg infantry were pushed back, and their subsequent counterattack to recapture the lost positions was repulsed. With fierce resistance, the left wing of the Allied forces began to falter as Fitzjames and his 10 battalions turned the flank of Zastro's troops. The entire left wing retreated into the Kaufung forest. As the Allies withdrew, Chevert's cavalry deployed in the plain, and the 8 squadrons of Allied cavalry attempting to cover the retreat were repeatedly pushed back in clashes with the French cavalry. Oberg, realizing the dire situation, ordered the centre and right wing to retreat towards Munden, hoping to salvage those parts of his army. The French artillery targeted the retreating Allies as they passed through a defile leading to Munden, inflicting significant damage on their artillery and ammunition wagons. However, Oberg managed to form a defensive line with several battalions in front of the defile, enabling the Allies to retire safely. Despite suffering major losses, including the capture of General Zastro, Oberg was fortunate to escape with a significant portion of his troops. After the French victory at the Battle of Lutterberg, Ferdinand did not plan to retreat to Hanover. Instead, he decided to pursue Contades, who was moving eastward, in an attempt to engage him before Chevert's return. However, Contades reacted quickly, and Ferdinand's forces were forced to retreat. In response to the threat posed by Contades, Ferdinand retired to Munster by October 31st. At this point, all sides recognized the need to prepare for winter quarters. The French, despite their victories, had been unable to eliminate Ferdinand or drive him out of Westphalia. Moreover, they had fully exploited the land they occupied. As a result, the French forces were also forced to retreat. Contades withdrew across the Rhine while Soubise evacuated most of Hesse and established his winter quarters south of the river Lahr. The campaign came to a close as both sides sought shelter and respite during the winter months. Thank you very much for watching this video. Please leave a like, it really helps out the channel. If there is a topic, battle, or person you would like to know more about, let me know your thoughts in a comment. I would also like to thank all my patrons and channel members for their generous support. If you enjoy House of History and you want to support my work, consider joining me on Patreon. For just $1 per month, you will already gain early access to all my videos without any in-video advertisements. Don't forget to subscribe. See you next time.